Hello and welcome to the fourth species counterpoint responses, the suspension. Okay, so first I'm going to look for anything wrong in this, and then after that I'm going to point out things that maybe just are unwanted or things that you probably should avoid. First, it's good to comprehend that we are doing syncopated suspensions, so because of that we are taking the whole note that would be under the given melody and we are shifting it metrically a half note in the measure. So we have that half note rest. And then the whole note, which turns into a tied half note because it's occurring in this measure and the next measure. So with that, we can realize that if we unshift the notes, if we unsyncopate everything, then we can have a rhythmic reduction of everything. In other words, if I get every note that's occurring on the upbeat of the measure, and I just look at that interval, that's also another way of just seeing the rhythmic reduction right there. Because that would turn into the same intervals as if you unsyncopated everything. And then with that, you wouldn't have the suspension. So it's basically just saying that the downbeat notes that are in here wouldn't be created because you just have the notes unsyncopated from the very beginning. So one thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the upbeats and we're going to see if there's perfect intervals, and we're going to see the previous upbeat and see if it is approached properly, because if we did a rhythmic reduction, then we might see an underlying problem that we might not realize is there when we're doing the suspensions. So it's good to realize that you can avoid having voice leading problems when creating suspensions if you realize what interval you're going to be creating on those upbeats and not doing anything that you normally wouldn't do in a one-to-one scenario. Okay, so let's get into this. Okay, so right away we can see a fifth on the upbeat of measure 3. And if we look at the previous upbeat, we see a third. We have G and B, and if we compare that to the fifth, we can see that it's traveling in contrary motion. The given melody B goes up to C, and the counterpoints G goes down to F. Okay, but then if we look a little further, we can see an octave right here. And then if we look at the previous upbeat, we can see that it is actually approaching in direct motion. So you can see the given melody going up, and also the counterpoint going up. And this is the last time I'm going to say this, but just a reminder that this is when we're unsyncopating everything. So it might not seem like that big of a deal right here, but it's good to pay attention to underlying issues and try to avoid them, especially because the whole point of learning counterpoint is to learn good voice leading. Okay, if we keep looking, we don't see any more perfect intervals on any upbeats. We do see the perfect unison on the very last measure, which occurs for the upbeat and the downbeat. And you can see that is previously approached in contrary motion. But when we're talking about underlying issues, when we're thinking about unsyncopating everything, that rhythmic reduction, it's also good to look for other things that we'd normally look out for in a one-to-one scenario. For example, having too many of the same intervals repeated in a row. If we look at the upbeat of measure 6, we can see a interval of a third. And then if we look at all the upbeats in the measures following that, we see another third, so that's 2, another third, 3, and then another third, 4, and then another third, 5. So 5 thirds in a row when you do that rhythmic reduction. The syncopation helps it out because it's changing these different notes and we're having these different intervals in the middle. So it's definitely different than just repeating thirds, but it makes you realize that on an underlying basis you have many thirds being repeated in a row. The preparation for the suspension of a dissonant suspension, where we have a 2-3 suspension, that fifth prepares us for another 2-2-3 suspensions in a row. So that's a lot of 2-3 suspensions occurring all very close to each other. So this also plays on the same thing of having those thirds all on the downbeats, because when you're creating a chain of, in this case, 2-3 suspensions, what you end up with is a bunch of thirds on each of your downbeats in a row. So this brings up something funny, because some people actually say that you could shoot for one of the possibilities could be creating a chain of the dissonant suspensions, while some people say to avoid it. So this is giving you both options here. Come up with your own answer. You should experiment for yourself and see what you think, if you think that this actually is not a big deal because the suspension is actually creating a gap in between each one. So it's throwing off the fact that you have a bunch of thirds occurring in a row when you do the rhythmic reduction and you look at underlying what's going on without it being syncopated. but the fact is it is being syncopated. That's what we're listening to. So again, the thirds in a row and the 2-3 suspensions could be a problem if that's something that you don't want, and so that's why I'm pointing it out. Okay, so next one, I'm going to be doing the same thing. We can see that in measure 3 here, we have a 12th, so a compound fifth. And if we look at the previous upbeat, we can see this is approached in contrary motion. The counterpoint goes down, and the given melody goes up. Okay, then in the next measure, we have an octave. And that leads us back to the compound fifth we were just talking about, and you can see this is approaching in contrary motion as well. You can see the given melody going up, and the counterpoint going down. And then here you might find this interesting. Is this a mistake? You have an octave going to a compound fifth, and it's not so much a mistake, but it's unwanted, because you have the octave, the lower voice is staying oblique, and the top voice is leaping, and the top voice being higher pitched obviously just stands out more. So when it's doing that leap, you're going to hear that a lot more. But because the bottom voice is staying oblique, this is allowed. Again, it's just something that you want to avoid. Then if we keep going, we actually see the same thing where we have an octave going to a compound fifth. This time we see the bottom voice is doing the leap and the top voice is staying oblique. So same thing, it's allowed but unwanted. Then here's where we see an underlying problem. We see after this compound fifth, in the next upbeat, we have another compound fifth. In the next upbeat, we have another compound fifth. So if you unsyncopated everything, you'd have a bunch of parallel compound fifths. So of course, that's a big no. You don't want a bunch of fifths moving in parallel motion. So that's where you can see that the issue here was that the prepare note for the suspension was a perfect interval every time. And then it was creating a chain of dissonant suspensions, causing it to land on the same exact note again, the same perfect interval. So picking the perfect interval for the note of the preparation of the dissonant suspension and then creating a chain of the same dissonant suspensions is going to create those parallel perfect intervals every time. So it's definitely something to look out for right there. Then after that, we do see the compound fifth going to the octave in contrary motion. Then the other thing to comment on is these compound fifths and also the tenths. We have more than an octave between the bass and the soprano. This is something that you don't want, especially having something like up to a compound fifth. You want to keep all of your top 3 voices within an octave of each other, so your soprano, alto, and tenor. And then your bass voice and your tenor voice can be over an octave apart, but we have a bass voice to a soprano voice. So you need to remember that you need to keep your bass voice an octave away from your alto and your soprano. And just because it's the bass voice doesn't mean that you can get away with putting a lot bigger intervals without running into problems, because you're going to avoid a lot of issues following those rules. For this next one, first of all, on the downbeat of measure 3, we have a fifth, and then on the next downbeat, we have a compound fifth. So there's multiple things going on here. First, right off the bat, we do see it's moving in contrary motion. Then second, we need to realize this being suspended. If you have 2 parallel perfect intervals on your downbeats and they're separated by a constant interval on the upbeat, then this is okay. It's not okay if it's a dissonant interval that is separating them. And then it's different because you have a fifth going to a compound fifth. So because of that, no matter if it's in contrary motion or not, that is normally a voice leading issue that is still considered parallel perfect intervals. Funny enough, even though they're not traveling in parallel motion to the same interval in a closed position, well, the motion is traveling in the same direction to a compound version of the interval. So it's a little weird, but that's one of these things. And these rules aren't just rules, they're things that help you have better voice leading. Okay, and then it's the same thing if you have a compound fifth or a compound perfect interval going to a regular or closed perfect interval. If they're the same type of interval, not allowed. If they're different perfect intervals, that's fine. We know that. If I had this going in contrary motion to an octave, that would be fine. But in this case, like I'm saying, this is fine because we have this consonant interval in the middle of them on the upbeat. So in this case, we're looking at parallel intervals on the downbeats, where we don't want a dissonance in between them. Then we have a perfect fifth on measure 5, and if we go to the previous upbeat, we can see that we have a 10th, or in other words, a compound third, and in fact that is traveling in contrary motion in the given melody as well as the counterpoint to that fifth. And then in this one, you don't see the same dissonant suspensions in a row. So if you were looking out for not doing the chain of dissonant suspensions, then here we don't have that. Then we can see that the high point in this is syncopated. So where the counterpoint leaps up to the high point, then it is suspended in the next measure, where the given melody then goes down, creating the actual highest point. And you can see that this is an interval of a compound fifth as we were talking about, but is made from scale degree 1 in the given melody, and then scale degree 5 in the counterpoint. So it's using the most stable scale degree and one of the most stable notes that you can use for your high point in one interval, also reinforcing the tonic of the key that we're using. Okay, so that's it for this one. Okay, the next one, now we're looking at minor. We go down to the second measure on the second line, and on the upbeat we see a perfect fifth. We see on the previous upbeat that it is traveling in direct motion in the counterpoint and the given melody. So you don't want that right there. So that's not a issue in the suspension, but that's an underlying issue that occurs if you rhythmically reduce everything. Then we see a perfect unison, and this is occurring on the upbeat, so because of that, the given melody is just staying the same note, but also the given melody is that note. So there's an ambiguity in what this voice is doing right here, which voice this is. It's the same exact note as the given melody and the counterpoint. So when that happens, it can be confusing for the listener to follow the voice leading, because now we only have one note, one voice. And then also you can't do contrary motion away from that, since this note is being suspended, so then it stays the same note in the next measure again. And this might just be personal, but I think a perfect unison sounds extra bad when it's being suspended. In my opinion, I would just completely try avoiding doing the perfect unison, especially in suspensions. We do see the perfect unison on the last note, which is not being suspended, and we see that's being approached in contrary motion. And furthermore, it's ending this whole thing where there's the counterpoint. So as the voices merge together on the very end, that is a little different than in the middle, all of a sudden they become the same voice. And then the last thing to point out before moving on is the register is pretty boring. If you look at it, it starts on B, goes down to A, goes back up to B, A, B, A, we go down to G, back up to B, A, and then B. So we had that one G dipping down in there. That was the one interesting point in this entire thing. So when building your suspensions, it would be better to have more interest than just one note going up and down and up and down. Of course, developing further and actually applying this to a piece of music, oftentimes your middle voices can be more boring, but just going from one note up and down, you could probably do something more interesting than that. And especially in these exercises, that's something you want to avoid. Because next one we have the B minor above. On this one we don't really see a lot of perfect intervals on the upbeats at all. We do see 2/5 right here on these downbeats in the second and third measures of the second line. But we see that consonant interval separating them in the middle on the upbeat, so perfectly fine. Then after that we see that fifth goes to an octave, and the given melody is of course taking up that whole measure, so again with that traveling in oblique motion and the top voice or one of the voices leaping into a different perfect interval, that's alright, but this is something you should avoid. Then of course the last note is always prepared in contrary motion. Those cadence formulas help you do that. And it's also good to pay attention to what notes, chords, or chord tones that these cadence formulas could be hinting at or sounding. This one, same thing. We don't see a lot of interest in the register. In this one, you go down to F instead of G, but not much interest at all. The one thing to point out is that now you have the bass to soprano relationship. You can see it's within an octave. It's not over an octave, so this is what you want to shoot for here. Next, C minor above. Here in measure 3, we see a perfect fifth, and then in measure 4, we see a perfect octave, and again, separated by that consonant interval in the upbeat. And now, same thing but opposite. Now we have an octave going to a fifth on the downbeats, and that consonant interval on the upbeat in the middle. Of course, this is when that syncopated suspension is occurring. It's not just having a consonant interval in the middle of these two parallel fifths. It's having a consonant interval that then that same note creating the consonant interval is suspended into the next measure, to where then that is clashing with the note changing in the next measure, creating that perfect interval. Moving on, we don't really see any perfect intervals on the upbeats, but what we do see is a pair of parallel fifths on the downbeats of measure 2 and 3 of the bottom line. And same thing, you have that consonant interval in the middle. Then that fifth goes to an octave. And again, that's something we want to avoid if we're not doing actual contrary motion. Okay, then in this one, we can definitely see there's more interest in the register. You see the notes are going up, they're going down, so it's definitely going to add a lot more interest. Okay, so that's it for this. If you enjoyed this, give it a like, subscribe to see more. I'm going to have a lot more videos coming out. And be sure to check out my other Counterpoint videos. I think I have somewhere close to 20 of them now. I'm going to post a playlist below that's going to have all the videos in a playlist from the very beginning video now here to this response video. You can find a PDF download for these responses that are blank. You can fill it in yourself on my 4th Species Counterpoint video, which I will also link down below. And until next time, goodbye.